Good morning. Thank you for being here today. My name is James Sage, and on behalf of Ryan Paul and his amazing team, I am pleased to welcome you to the final Eccles APEX presentation for fall 2024. I'd like to thank the Eccles Foundation for their generous and continuous support of this premier speaker series. Today's Eccles APEX presentation is titled Exploring the Civil War's Timeless Legacy. I'd like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the Apex Radio Hour podcast. It's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rik Scarce, professor of sociology at Skidmore College, where he's been teaching since 2003. Prior to that, Rik held faculty appointments at both Michigan State University and Montana State University. In terms of teaching, Rik's specialty courses include environmental sociology, social theories of the environment, visual sociology, video ethnography, and contemporary social theory. Rik's scholarship is varied in both topic and in format. For example, in 2020, his film on barefoot running, called Impact, was selected for inclusion at 3 film festivals, winning the Audience Choice Award at the Austin Indie Fest. He is also the author of the book Creating Sustainable Communities, Lessons from the Hudson River Region, and was the filmmaker of the parallel documentary for that book called Sustaining This Place, Creating a New Hudson River Region Landscape. Both of those were released in 2015. Rik has also published 3 other books and numerous other scholarly articles and book chapters on the social construction of nature and on research ethics. To say the least, Rik has had a full and accomplished career as a faculty member. In anticipation of his retirement, in 2021, Rik began studying for the Gettysburg National Military Park's Licensed Battlefield Guide examination. That's a mouthful. I practiced that for weeks. That exam, to be a licensed battlefield guide, has been called the toughest exam in history. Rik has devoted nearly 3 hours a day since 2021, I believe it was April of 21, studying for that exam. That exam happens in 1 month, on December 7th. This is his final exam. His presentation today is based on his experience preparing for that exam and learning about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War more generally. Now, most biographical sketches would stop there and I'd get off the stage and Rik would come up and begin his presentation. But as a point of personal privilege, I asked Ryan if I could introduce Rik today, because I've known Rik since 1991 for 33 years. My first semester as an undergraduate student, Rik was my professor. He was a graduate student, but he was my teacher of Intro to Sociology. My very first semester in college. And yeah, I learned a lot from Rik in those 4 years that we overlapped at Washington State University. I learned a lot. I learned about sociology, research methods. Rik also had the role of critiquing my writing, which must have been painful as a 17 or 18-year-old. But I have to say that Rik really encouraged me to keep asking questions, to think about disciplines, to think across and between disciplines, and to think about how we can better extend our understanding of ourselves and the world we live in by examining those disciplines that are so conventional in higher ed. But I want to say, and this is the part I was telling Wendy that I might have a hard time getting through, so I'm going to try to hold it together here. Besides intellectual curiosity, what Rik demonstrated was way more personal. What he demonstrated was moral courage, personal integrity, and a commitment to professional ethics. That was not something that I earned a credit, but I learned a lot from Rik. I think what Rik has taught me and everybody he's influenced over his career is that your actions based on your principles and your values make a difference in this world. And we need more people like Rik who act with courage and integrity. Whew. I made it further than I thought. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rik Scarce to Southern Utah University and to the Eccles APEX stage. Please welcome Rik.
Well, good morning. People usually stand up, frankly, and say, thank you for those kind remarks and so forth, and they've written them themselves. I didn't write any of that. It was really, really generous of James to say what he did, and thank you, my dear, dear friend, for making my visit here possible. James and I developed a close friendship, and then in the darkest hour of my life, when I was standing up against the federal government in support of research ethics and those sorts of high principles, James and his now wife Toni were there for me, pardon me, and for my family. It's impossible for me to overstate really how exceptional a person James is. SUU should be incredibly proud of his presence here and incredibly appreciative for all that he does. He's helping to transform your campus. So thank you, my old friend, for this opportunity to share some thoughts with your community. I also want to thank Professor Paul Ryan, who coordinates the APEX series and who really made the logistics for my visit here exceptionally easy to work through. Ryan also gave me free rein to explore whatever topic I chose, and his encouragement played a major role in how I framed my remarks today. So, Ryan, thank you very, very much. It's really an honor to be with you to speak as part of the APEX series and to address a topic that I am eminently unqualified to speak about. At least if you look at my college degrees, I've got 2 in political science, 1 in sociology, and not a single one in history. But as I look down the path just a few months to my retirement from Skidmore College, I see a bend in the trail that I've trod since 1990, when I began my sociology studies. And that curve takes me in the direction of history, in particular, as James mentioned, the American Civil War. The Civil War has been with me all my life, and that presence has its roots in the make-believe battles that my childhood friends and I played growing up. But why did we relive that war? I'm old enough that my father and my friends' fathers had recently gotten back from the Second World War. The Civil War ended a full century before that, after all. The esteemed historian Robert Paxton pointed me toward an answer to my confusion about why we were so consumed about the Civil War. In a recent interview, he said, "My fellow Southerners spent their time researching, debating, commemorating, rewriting, and even reenacting that 4-year war for Southern independence." That observation helped me understand what was going on with me and my friends, though we spent less time debating the war than we did reenacting it. For the Civil War had not faded from memory, in the North Carolina of my youth. It was all around us, usually quietly, but ever present. And it never did fade from my memory. One of the most meaningful trips of my life occurred in my 20s when I visited Gettysburg National Military Park for the first time. It's a breathtaking place. 6,000 acres are preserved there on the ground in southern Pennsylvania, where the greatest Civil War battle of them all took place. Monuments, almost all to Union regiments, brigades, or officers, cover the battlefield. There are barren, steep, forbidding hillsides, tree-covered ridges, 10 acres of massive boulders called Devil's Den, a placid stream side known as the Slaughter Pen, and old farms and orchards where corn, sorghum, and peaches still grow just as they did in 1863. And in the middle of it all stands a once quaint village that today is an odd mixture of leafy neighborhoods, tourist trap stores, and shady folks offering ghost tours every evening. Over it all hangs a palpable sense of history. Something remarkable happened at Gettysburg. The trajectory of a nation was changed, for one thing, and thanks to a short speech by Abraham Lincoln, world history changed there as well. The Battle of Gettysburg wouldn't leave me. Over the last few decades, I read Michael Shera's novel based on the battle, titled The Killer Angels, over and over. I watched the really awful movie based on that book, simply titled Gettysburg, more times than I will admit. If it's available in your college library, go ahead and pass on it. Don't check that one out. Don't stream it. Just move right along. I also conquered Shelby Foote's 3,000-page narrative history of the war and reread the section on the Battle of Gettysburg titled The Stars in Their Courses Most Summers. And it was on a trip there 3.5 years ago that I discovered the Gettysburg licensed battlefield guides that James mentioned earlier. The guides have been designated by the National Park Service as the only people who may show visitors around the field for a fee. I immediately knew I wanted to be a guide in my retirement. And exactly 1 month from today, as James mentioned, I start my journey toward that end. On December 7th, a day that I hope will not live in personal infamy, I will sit for the written part of the Gettysburg Battlefield Guide exam. If I pass and do well on the further 3 stages of the exam process, which will stretch into next summer, I will be given a badge and an arm patch and a piece of paper that affirm my status. Now it's my turn to choke up. As a Gettysburg licensed battlefield guide. Yeah, it's kind of emotional thinking about wrapping up something that you started 3.5 years ago. I think the seniors in the room can empathize with that. So that's how a sociology professor morphed himself into a pseudo-historian, studying for thousands of hours in preparation for what one Civil War magazine, as James said, describes as the hardest test in history. If the actual historians in the room will forgive me, I'm going to step into their world for a moment and identify 4 things that the Civil War has left us with. Some are gifts, others burdens, but they all are traceable to that long ago war and all are relevant to our lives today. I'll get to those 4 things in a moment, but let me set it up for you for a few minutes. The American Civil War is a sticky thing, yet to many of you, the war hardly even seems relevant, I'm sure. It began a long time ago, 163 years, 6 months, and 25 days ago, to be exact. The world of 1861 was radically different from our own. Train travel at a whopping 40 miles an hour was the quickest way to get around, but you still couldn't get to that many places. This was 8 years before the Golden Spike, and there were only 30,000 miles of track in the entire nation. That's 70,000 fewer miles of train track in the United States of 1861 than Utah has road miles today. The telegraph was the quickest way to communicate. Imagine texting someone, but the message has to be read and retyped multiple times before it ever arrives on your friend's phone. Roughly speaking, that was the telegraph. Other differences between today and then are equally shocking. At the dawn of the Civil War, respectable people's clothing completely covered everything from the chin down. Yes, even in a hot Utah summer. More than half of the population worked on farms. Today it's 2%. And every ship that had ever existed in world history had been made of animal skin, wood, or some other kind of fiber. Yet within the first year of the Civil War, Union and Confederate ships made of iron fought a sea battle. Utah didn't become a state for 35 years after the war began. Old Maine, right here on your campus, wasn't constructed until 1898, 37 years after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The first airplane wouldn't fly for 42 years. The first television broadcast was 65 years in the future. The women's suffrage movement was still in its infancy. Women wouldn't vote for the first time until 1920. None of the businesses you will interact with today existed when the Civil War began. And most tellingly, Childish Gambino would not be born for 120 years, and Taylor Swift for 128. Clearly, the Civil War occurred in the Dark Ages. Maybe not before electricity, but there wasn't much anyone was doing with electrons back then other than sending those painfully slow telegrams. But keep in mind that history has inflection points, moments maybe lasting an instant, some taking place over a few years or even longer, when social trajectories and future generations of personal biography are altered. The range of possible futures is changed, new possibilities arise, and awful new problems emerge as well. The American Civil War was one of those inflection points, setting this nation on a new course, mostly for good, but also sending us down tragic paths. And that's why I say it's sticky. Our world today is quietly but inevitably linked to a war that was fought between 1861 and 1865. What kind of turning point was the Civil War? Well, 750 men and surreptitiously a handful of women were killed in combat during the war. At least 50,000 American civilians died as well. Race relations were fundamentally changed. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 3/4 of the American slaves. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ending slavery completely, was passed by Congress while the war still raged. And the 14th and 15th Amendments, giving us constitutional rights to due process, equal protection, and ensuring the right to vote regardless of race, were ratified by the states within 5 years of the end of the war. Yet for all the carnage and all the changes, there is much more to the trajectory that the Civil War put us on. To understand that new path, we must begin even farther back in American history. The war's origins are directly traceable to 1619, the year the first kidnapped African people were landed on these shores and sold into slavery. By 1808, when the international slave trade was finally outlawed by the young United States government, 645,000 human beings had been ripped from their homes and families and forced into servitude here on this continent. Every state allowed slavery, but gradually it died out north of the Mason-Dixon line, that boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and symbolically between the North and the South. But thanks to the lack of industrialization in the South and the invention in 1794 of the cotton gin, which with the turn of a crank completed the laborious job of separating cotton seeds from the fibers, slavery not only persisted but grew in importance in the South. By 1860, the year of Abraham Lincoln's first election as president, slaves constituted 1/8 of the American population. Blacks, almost none of whom were free, comprised more than half of the population in South Carolina and Mississippi. But for all that, the Civil War did not begin as a struggle over slavery. In fact, Lincoln and his Republican Party included a plank in their 1860 platform guaranteeing Southerners the right to own slaves. No, it was the extension of slavery to places like Cuba, Nicaragua, New Mexico, and yes, Utah, that troubled Lincoln and spurred on the fire-breathing secessionists in the South. In the months following Lincoln's election, one Southern state after another left the Union, 11 in all, and in April 1861, the first shots of the conflict were fired by Southerners. The war would drag on for almost exactly 4 years. Every major battle in the first year eclipsed anything ever witnessed in North America. The first Battle of Bull Run in Virginia, fought 3 months after the conflict began, was bloodier than all the battles of the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War put together. At the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, 8,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in just 4 hours. Then came the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, the largest of them all, with 51,000 casualties, including 7,000 killed there on the battlefield. Another 4,000 would die by August of their wounds suffered at Gettysburg. On the war trudged until finally, in April 1865, Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee surrendered the most skilled and most venerated Southern Army to future President and then General Ulysses S. Grant in a tiny Virginia village, Appomattox. The remaining Southern armies soon lay down their arms as well, and so our greatest national tragedies, slavery and the Civil War, ended at the same moment. Or did they? Slavery did, yes, and the fighting subsided, it's true. But the ignorance-fueled furies of prejudice, oppression, violence, and resentment of the turning point that was the Civil War remain to this day. As it is for me now, as I prepare for that Gettysburg Guide exam, from at least 1859 through 1877, the war in some way, shape, or form was never far from Americans' minds. Why 1859 through 1877 if the war only lasted from 61 to 65? Although anxieties about a possible North-South conflict had been growing for decades, it was John Brown's raid of the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October 1859 that convinced many Southerners that war was likely coming. And as for that end date, 1877, that was when Reconstruction's death throes subsided and the hopes for a changed South, built on a model ensuring equal rights, equal protection, equal justice, equal education, and equal opportunity for all, fell into the abyss. It was lost there until the Civil Rights Movement and, of course, the full light of a new, just day has not shone in many corners of the South, or for that matter, in the North and here in the West yet. Reconstruction is an apt topic for me to shift to as I share the first of those 4 central observations about the Civil War's legacy. Reconstruction was Lincoln's term for the task of completely remaking social life. Consider the economy. Imagine the immense task of stripping away an economic system based on forced labor and replacing it with one founded on free labor. Former slaves were starting from a position of less than nothing. That is, they not only possessed no wealth, they had themselves been property. After the infamous Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, their flesh and bones and brains and toil were, in the eyes of the law, the economic equivalent of a mule or a hammer. Enslaved people were things, they were objects. The Civil War restored personhood to those people. And that observation gets us to the first of my 4 points, the importance of finishing the good, vital, essential things this nation starts. You see, the immensely important work of Reconstruction was never completed. The entity created by the federal government to oversee Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. Beyond the immense task of ensuring former slaves enjoyed the basic rights of citizenship, the Freedmen's Bureau educated formerly enslaved people. 90% of those held in bondage were illiterate. And it worked to reunite families that had been separated by slaveholders when they bought and sold their human so-called property. More on that topic in just a moment. When President Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, the same month that the war ended, his deeply racist, profoundly incompetent Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the highest office in the land. His Reconstruction policies offered no support to freed women and men. So in 1867, Congress stepped in to take control of Reconstruction. The laws they wrote in the next 6 years, many passed over Johnson's vetoes, were the first steps in the process of ensuring that all Americans could pursue their dreams. Congress passed the Enforcement Acts to make it possible that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were complied with. One of them, the Ku Klux Klan Act, broke the back of that hateful organization by allowing victims of its terrorism to sue for damages in federal court. It was a first in the nation's history. Congress also sent federal troops to 10 of the 11 former Confederate states to oversee the Enforcement Acts and other federal laws. Tennessee was the exception since it had rewritten its constitution to guarantee equal rights. Congress's efforts worked. Black families were reunited. They began working their own land and raising the first generation of free black children in the South. They worshiped openly, went to school, and walked the streets as equals in every way to the whites around them. More than 600 black men, women of course could not vote or hold office yet, were elected to southern state legislatures, a large percentage of whom were former slaves. 16 blacks were elected to Congress and 2 were elected to the U.S. Senate, both of them from the state of Mississippi. As sociologist, historian W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of Reconstruction, the slave went free and stood a brief moment in the sun. But Southern white supremacy, latent Northern racism, and national politics blocked what was always destined to be a long path to universal equality barely a decade after the end of the Civil War. The work was not finished. Nor was that quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. The complete line reads, "The slave went free and stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery." By the late 1880s, virtually all of the progress made in the South was lost or being rolled back. We failed to complete Reconstruction. Sadly, that unwillingness to fulfill the ideals and the Declaration of Independence, universal freedom, inalienable rights enjoyed by all, and equality of opportunity guaranteed by a fair and just government has been a hallmark of the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1864 was considered an endpoint, not a beginning, and reactionary Supreme Courts have curtailed its effect. In turn, Congress has failed to strengthen what the justices have weakened. The Equal Rights Amendment has never been fully ratified. We struggle still over rights for trans people and disabled people and First Nations people, immigrants, and yes, still all people of color. Our nation is hobbled by its inability to finish the laudable things it starts. As we have always done, we've allowed difference to become division, and that observation leads me to my second lesson we can draw from the Civil War: accepting the presence of difference without allowing it to tear us apart. Let's start with the final straw of the antebellum pre-war saga, the one that many Southern leaders felt gave them no choice but to rebel: the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860. Why? Here we return to slavery, but not just the generic concept of chattel slavery, as reprehensibly inhumane as it was. No, we have to go to the heart and soul of slavery, its core economic purpose: to make ever greater profit. Wealthy Southern planters, ensconced as they were in a capitalist system that demanded greater and greater economic growth, wanted to expand their business. Well, you might say, their business was growing crops. Why not buy more land and grow even more? Thing is, over time, farming became secondary to slave selling. What was the most valuable commodity the South had to sell? Surely it was cotton. The South practiced keen cotton diplomacy during the war, after all, in an attempt to force England and France, which were hungry for more cotton for their clothing mills, to support its rebellion. But no, cotton was not the South's most valuable commodity, not tobacco or sugar either. No, the South's greatest so-called resource was human beings. Collectively, those held in bondage were more valuable than all of the factories and railroads in the United States combined. And so the thing that had always healed the nation's divisions in the past, compromise, became economically and therefore politically impossible to accomplish with someone like Lincoln as president. Or at least that's what the South's ruling elites declared. For his part, Lincoln embraced compromises to allow slavery to persist in the South. He infamously wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Lincoln supported the Corwin Amendment, a last-ditch compromise that would have become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution if it had passed. It prohibited Congress from outlawing slavery. But the Southern planters distrusted Lincoln and his fellow Republicans. By late 1860, they were hell-bent on rebellion, and so the South revolted. The elite brought an immensely destructive conflict upon themselves, one that would see Southern whites' wealth decline by 60% between 1860 and 1870, because they wanted to extend the slave trade. Absolutists, the planters, chose war over the resolution of differences with the North. For fully 1/4 of white Southern men, it proved to be a war with deadly consequences, and they were the dead ones. Civil War historian Shelby Foote has said that America's, quote, great genius is its ability to compromise. However, that supposed genius isn't always so intelligent or far-sighted, and it certainly is not inevitably moral. Slavery, our nation's original sin, was written into the Constitution without the word ever being used as part of a compromise. And the most undemocratic provision in the Constitution, the Electoral College, was a compromise intended to assuage Southerners' anxieties regarding the maintenance of slavery and the slave trade. As such, compromise is closely implicated in the Civil War. So we're confronted with a contradiction. Compromise, our political way of working through difference, is a tool for progress, or it isn't. I think the spirit of Foote's observation is a sound one. In a nation as large and politically complex as ours, and given that we chose something other than a parliamentary system to enact our representative democracy, compromise seems to be essential. And in fact, we have compromised about virtually every important thing that has ever come out of the halls of Congress. The horrifying takeaway from the compromises that kept slavery alive and kicking for so long is their rejection of basic humanity. Southerners told themselves a series of lies about black people's intelligence, their capacity for work and even war-making, and about their potential to ever be fully human as a way to justify white supremacy and white ownership of other human beings. And that view extended to all non-whites. As such, slavery is a special, extreme, and unconscionable case when it comes to compromise. While such explicit dehumanization has hardly been absent from political, that's a Freudian slip, has largely been absent from political rhetoric since 2015, the last 10 years clearly teach us that othering our fellow human beings, stereotyping them, decrying their cultures, their faiths, their practices and outlooks, perpetuating violence against them, and otherwise associating difference with evil ought to have no place in our time or in our political system. When moral panics and other social conflicts emerge, the emphasis must be on issues and policies, not on groups of our fellow human beings and our fellow citizens. I think a perfectly reasonable response to those observations is to ask, your high-minded ideals are all well and good, but how do we ensure that people are treated as people and that social groups aren't condemned using tropes that are unmoored from reality? What law, heck, what constitutional amendment could possibly prevent politicians from making outlandish claims about our neighbors, our friends, and our family members? These questions bring us to a third takeaway from the Civil War, the absolute necessity of leadership grounded in, as Lincoln put it in his first inaugural address, the better angels of our nature. Those were Lincoln's closing words in a speech begging the South not to secede from the Union. And just a few sentences before speaking them, he said, "My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time." It was March 4th, 1861, and the secession movement had already boiled off any deliberate cool-headedness in the 7 southern states that had voted to break away from the United States of America. 4 more states would secede by early June. But in our time, Lincoln's pleas could and should be taken to heart whenever the issues of the day arise, even to a simmer. Pause, Lincoln begged the South. Consider those compromises you rejected. Check your rhetoric against the facts. Come to the table with your ideas. Work with us. At the opposite end of the Civil War, we find an example of better angels touching a leader and fundamental decency at work because those gentler voices were heeded. If you had successfully led a vast army through years of carnage and sat facing your opposite number across the surrender table, what would your demands be? Let you think about that while I take a sip of water. That was the problem Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant faced on April 9th, 1865, in that little Virginia town that I mentioned earlier, Appomattox. 2 days before, Grant sent a note across the battle lines to Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee. He wrote, "I regard it as my duty to shift from myself responsibility for any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of your army." Finally, on the morning of the 9th, realizing continued resistance was suicidal, Lee agreed to meet Grant to discuss the surrender of Lee's army. What did Grant demand? Did he imprison Lee and his officers on charges of treason? Did he take every scrap of property from them and their men? Did he go about building a gigantic stockade to house his new captives? No, none of that. Soldiers could keep their horses, which they would desperately need to work their fields back home. Officers even kept their pistols, swords, and revolvers. Moreover, Lee's army was out of food. Grant fed them. A couple of days later, the Confederates formally surrendered. Then every Confederate soldier went home and was free to live his life as before the war, so long as they did not take arms up against the United States. Grant, guided by Lincoln's expectations, recognized that healing the nation's wounds could begin with him. The victorious commanding general could do his part to reduce tensions and to welcome Confederates back into the Union, and that he did. Now, in the second term of his presidency, Grant was responsible for shameful backsliding on Reconstruction, and as such, he bears distant responsibility for some of the racial prejudices that permeate our society today. But at Appomattox, the vital work of binding the nation's wounds began with so-called unconditional surrender. Grant, compassionate and empathetic leadership, like that demonstrated by Lincoln and Grant in their best moments, is always in short supply, it seems, and we must demand better from our leaders. For my final point in this admittedly eclectic list of takeaways from the Civil War, I stay with Lincoln, but shift to some of the words that are found in the greatest speech in American history, his Gettysburg Address, because they invoke the nation's ideals. And I want to argue that the Civil War showed that we must never take our collective eye off of those lofty things, those lofty ideas that made America what it is. By the time Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, 4 months after the fighting in that little community ended, his views about slavery had dramatically changed from what they were early in the war. Freedom, Lincoln concluded, had been revealed as the Civil War's true focus, and he decided that his remarks at Gettysburg would be a call for all Americans to recognize that high, newfound purpose. But before Lincoln could speak that day, the featured act had to go on. A man named Edward Everett. Everett was the nation's foremost orator, which made him the day's equivalent of Beyoncé or Taylor Swift. Although he neither sang nor danced, he did spin a good yarn, and his speeches lasted as long as a concert does today. Everett's illustrious career has been lost to the mists of history, but he had been president of Harvard University, a U.S. senator, the ambassador to England, and of all things, the vice presidential candidate on the Constitutional Union Party ticket in 1860, which means he ran against Abraham Lincoln on the ticket that garnered the third most electoral votes in that four-way election. Thank goodness Lincoln won. Presidents back then didn't get out to speak very often, and since Everett was the big draw, the invitation to Lincoln specified that he offer only a few appropriate remarks. In other words, keep it short, chum. Famously, Lincoln did precisely that, just 272 words beginning with 87 years ago. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln was trying to do several things. Honoring the fallen Union soldiers freshly interred before him was essential, of course. He movingly invoked those heroes' sacrifice when he spoke of, quote, the last full measure of devotion, end quote, that they gave in defense of their country and its principles. Reminding a war-weary North that their cause was good and righteous was of tremendous importance as well. Lincoln spoke of the, quote, unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced, end quote. But it is a third takeaway from the Gettysburg Address that has become the foremost reason why people around the world know and love his little speech. Lincoln invoked the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, particularly its emphasis on freedom and equality for all, as the new driving force of the war, as the new driving force for America. He had issued the Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning of that year, a document that was all about freeing Black Americans held in bondage in areas of the nation still under Confederate control. Now at Gettysburg, Lincoln was reminding his audience and ultimately the world of the heart of what made and still makes America great. Our embrace of freedom grounded in democracy, rule by us, the people. He envisioned nothing less than a renaissance for America when he concluded the Gettysburg Address by proclaiming that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln's remarks reminded his listeners then, as they remind readers today, of the essential ideals in the Declaration of Independence, that in contrast to the monarchies in Europe with their God-given right of kings, the United States would be ruled by those selected by the people. Moreover, our representatives all the way up to the president would govern us in our interest, not in theirs. Of the people, by the people, for the people. What Lincoln said still resonates. The Gettysburg Address is a truly timeless document. Its lasting power is often revealed in small ways. For instance, several years ago, Gettysburg National Military Park rebranded itself by adopting a new motto, For more than a century, its emphasis had been on Gettysburg as the high watermark of the Southern Rebellion, reflecting the Gettysburg Campaign as the farthest north that a Confederate army penetrated during the war, and explicitly focusing on the rebel cause. The park's newer understanding of itself, founded in Lincoln's call for that new birth of freedom, not so subtly shifts Gettysburg from the decades-long grip of reconciliationist rhetoric, which forced the issue of slavery into the shadows, and instead recenters Gettysburg National Military Park on what Lincoln had done through the Emancipation Proclamation and the virtue he extolled in his address: bring black freedom, bring freedom for us all into the light. And so today, the first thing you see when you enter the museum at Gettysburg is a moving, even shocking presentation on slavery, replete with actual shackles and numbing slave narratives. The Gettysburg Address's power is present in our lives in more sweeping ways as well. That phrase, unfinished work, that I quoted earlier, appears at first glance as a reference to the war. Let's finish the fight, Lincoln seems to be saying. Let's win the war. And he was referring to the war, no doubt. But if he was only referring to the fight, why not just say that? Why not note the unfinished struggle or the unfinished defense of the Union? No, I think unfinished work was a double entendre, an allusion both to the war and to the ceaseless effort to fulfill the Declaration's high ideals, which the war was fundamentally a part of. Peering into the immediate future, Lincoln saw that black Americans were freed, until black Americans were freed, none were truly free. But he surely grasped that freedom was not only race-based, it was a matter of gender, of labor, and more. Freedom was both America's purpose and its pursuit, and that pursuit would be never-ending. Our struggle to create a more perfect union will never be complete. History in this sense can never be completed. It's a Sisyphean task. There's no such thing as perfection or completeness, certainly not when it comes to liberty. But we can and must work toward bettering our collective lot, ensuring liberty for all, whether we can trace our ancestry on this land to a time before Columbus, to the Mayflower, or to our arrival just a few years ago from a land far or distant. So where does this journey through some of the Civil War's legacies leave us? For one, as I think you can appreciate, history is a messy thing. To note just one of the several of those uncomfortable, difficult to reconcile points, those of us who revere Lincoln as the greatest president must wrestle with his complex journey, from citizen who was disgusted by slavery to politician who would allow all 4 million slaves to remain in bondage to maintain the Union, to the Lincoln of the Emancipation Proclamation, who still would have only freed 3 of the 4 million, to the Lincoln of 1865, who, in the last months of his life, saw the 13th Amendment freeing all enslaved peoples passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification. For me, my point about the unfulfilled promise of the Declaration of Independence is probably the one that stands out as most important. It pained me a moment ago that we will never complete the journey that the Declaration set us on. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that in your lifetime you will see the pursuit of liberty to be central to our nation's journey. The danger is not that we might not learn from history and therefore repeat it, as Edmund Burke insisted. Rather, the true challenge is that we might forget our historical legacies and fail to pursue them. In recalling what is left unfinished in our long collective march toward freedom for all, by embracing difference and finding strength in it rather than division, by demanding of our leaders the wisdom that can only be found in empathy and compassion, and by never losing sight of the ideals that are the bedrock of our nation, We find in the Civil War not dusty, time-worn, and outdated irrelevancies of no use to us today. To the contrary, our nation needs those things as much today as it ever has. Thank you very much.